Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me More About Food History, featuring alumni Dr. Ashley Rose Young. I'm Catherine Allen, Assistant Director on the undergraduate team in the Duke Career Center, and I'd like to introduce you to our student interviewer, Josie Vonk. Josie is a sophomore pursuing a major in psychology and certificates in documentary studies and innovation and entrepreneurship. As for future aspirations, Josie plans on one day opening her own restaurant. On campus, she is part of the Penny Pilgrim George Women's Leadership Initiative, the Duke Student Alumni Board, and is a resident assistant in Bell Tower. She is also a teaching assistant for Professor Post-Rust documentary photography courses and is a leader in Campus Crusaders for Christ. In her free time, Josie loves to cook and experiment in the kitchen, and she can also be found on the main quad tossing a frisbee with friends. Thanks so much, Josie.
It's such a joy to be here. I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Ashley Rose Young. Dr. Ashley Rose Young is the historian of the American Food History Project at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She is the host and historian of Cooking Up History, the museum's cooking demonstration series. She also co-curated the museum's main food history exhibition, Food, Transforming the American Table. She is currently working on 2 books, an academic manuscript about New Orleans street food culture and a historically informed cookbook about Chef Lena Richard. Young earned a PhD in history from Duke University, an MA in history from Duke University, a BA in history from Yale University, and was also a visiting scholar at Oxford University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. As you can tell, I really like history, so it's a fun conversation for sure.
Yeah, and another big draw, I think, for a lot of audience members is the food. It's not very often that we get to attend an event related to food, but it's definitely something that we all care about since we eat every day. Tell me a little bit more about where your relationship with food really started.
So it starts with many of us, day one, we're born, we need food. But for me, it goes back to my family's food business. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I grew up in the suburbs. My mom and my aunts owned and operated 3 gourmet grocery food stores in Pittsburgh called McGinnis Sisters. And the stores were started by my grandfather and my grandmother, but my mom and aunts took over the business in the early 80s. And so, I grew up 2-3 years old at my mom's knees, going into the store and helping put sauce on pizzas to start with, working in the cheese department, wrapping cellophane around cheeses. Eventually, I graduated to the seafood department where I peeled thousands and thousands of shrimp, more shrimp that I could possibly want to peel or devein, but that's where I spent a lot of my youth. And then eventually, joined my mom in the bakery departments and during holidays would wake up at midnight, 1 a.m, go into the stores and help my mom prepare baked goods and whatnot for those major food holidays. So I really grew up around food entrepreneurs and food businesses and their gourmet grocery stores. So we were supporting, local producers, our farmers in Western Pennsylvania. We were always advocating to source our product from them in terms of fresh foods like your produce and your meats. But then we also did import a lot of olive oils and sauces and cheeses from Europe at a time when, you couldn't find that kind of product at your local grocery store. I mean, this is in the 80s and 90s before, today you go to your grocery store and many of them are going to have imported goods from all across the world, but it took us a while to get to that place of availability. So yes, I do attribute my love of food to my mother and my aunts, and also my interest in food businesses and food entrepreneurship to just growing up in that environment.
And so, like, with this theme of food, we can also see a twist of history through the degrees you have so far. Tell me a little bit more about that intersection of food and history for you.
Yes, of course. So so I said my mom was a food entrepreneur, and my father was a high school history teacher in Western Pennsylvania. And so, I always joke that my family, instead of going to, I don't know, say Disney World for their family vacations, we always went to Colonial Williamsburg. We went to visit, the National Mall and the Smithsonian museums. We visited so many, Civil War battlefields and forts like Fort Wilderness and things like that, in Pennsylvania, all the way down to North Carolina. So I really grew up with a love of and a curiosity for, history, public history, living history museums, the Smithsonian museums. And so it all kind of came together in college when I had the chance to intern at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. And I was their first ever intern at this community museum in the Big Easy. And I'd never been to New Orleans. I'd really never been that far south before. And I learned about the city day one through its food culture, through its historic cookbooks. I walked into the museum and I said, I really want to learn about Creole food and its history. What should I read? And they pointed me to these really historic cookbooks from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I was just, fascinated, caught off guard, curious about the way that people talked about the history of Creole cuisine and how it came to be, and the role of women and people of color in the creation of that cuisine. So that really captured my interest, and I wanted to learn more. And I ended up writing my senior history thesis on that topic, and I went straight to grad school from there to continue studying New Orleans. But it was at that museum that I really learned the power of public history, history designed for the public, whether it's an exhibition or a cooking class or a museum tour. I just felt so at home. And I fell in love with really serious research that's meant to be communicated with a broader public. And so that experience at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum really anchored me in what became my career and what I do today.
I'm curious, where did the idea for your New Orleans street food culture active manuscript come from? Is it a brainchild from that first museum?
In some ways, I do think it is. So looking back at those historic cookbooks, what I found really interesting, and again, I said these are from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So they were published at a time that it was the Jim Crow South. They were published at a time where there was a lot of nostalgia, especially among a white American population, for a romanticized antebellum past. So this reimagining of what New Orleans culture was like during slavery, but it was romanticized. It wasn't real. It didn't honor or recognize the horrors of slave society. But in that kind of romanticized vision, excuse me, they often included images of street vendors. Many of them were Black women who sold kala, which are sugary rice fritters, in the streets of New Orleans, who sold pralines, who made gumbo and prepared coffee in the city's historic markets and in the city squares. And I was really interested in why these images kept cropping up in these cookbooks. And so there was a spark of interest in this historic street food culture, which you don't really see in New Orleans today. You don't have a really robust presence of street vendors in the city. There are food trucks, of course, but that culture of vendors, in municipal markets, so, municipally regulated markets or on the city streets, like corners and whatnot, doesn't exist. However, when I was an undergrad, and when I was in graduate school, I had the chance to travel abroad. And I visited places like Singapore, where they have this incredibly dynamic, historic, robust street food culture. I mean, they have communities there in their city-sponsored housing where each kind of group of city condominiums has a public market at its center, where the people living in those units, like in a quad of high rises, that's where they go to get their produce. And then I was in India. I saw a very similar situation with just this robust street food presence. The same in Morocco, Egypt, even in places in Europe, there are still vestiges of these food markets in France and Italy, in Germany. And so I kept thinking, why why is there still this culture and this history in other parts of the world, but not in the United States? And what happened? Now, if you go to New York City, you can still see some street vendors, for example, selling churros on the side of the road, or you might be in Miami and see women selling fresh fruit with chile spice on it and things like that. But it's not anywhere near the number of street food vendors that we had in the 1800s or early 1900s. So I really wanted to know what happened to our street vendors. Why did their numbers reduce so drastically? And what was their story, of these small scale business entrepreneurs? And that's how I like to think of them, as people who are working in a business. They're supporting their family. Why are they working in that industry? How did they push local law and shift local law to their advantage? And how did they express power in an economy that really tried to marginalize them? Often these street vendors were women, people of color, recent migrants. And so I was really interested in the dynamics of just a different way of building a life for yourself outside of traditional stores and storefronts, but rather in the city streets. So that's kind of where that project originated.
Looking internationally, is there a certain country that their street food culture really caught your eye?
Well, like I said, Singapore really caught my attention. I will also say in Peru, I was so interested in the presence of women in particular as the face of businesses in Peru, where if you're going to buy fresh produce or if you're going to buy artisan goods, women are often in charge of those businesses. Where, for example, when I was in Italy, for example, or France, southern France, it was men who traditionally were at the storefront. Or even Morocco, it was men who I was interacting with, and I very rarely saw women as the face of those small scale businesses. So those gender dynamics in Peru really caught my attention, because I am interested in gender, and I'm interested in how women carve out an economic toehold for themselves as food entrepreneurs. And I do think those cultural differences in communities across the globe are really interesting. You see similar trends in West Africa historically, where women were the predominant food vendors. And you see those traditions brought across the Atlantic when people were forcibly, brought here through enslavement. You see those women become street vendors when they become free, or if they're working for, enslavers. They were street vendors, and they used those business skills that they brought with them to build their businesses. And sometimes enslaved women were able to keep some of the profits from the produce that they might have sold for their enslavers, and they could purchase their freedom in rare circumstances, but they could purchase their freedom through this small scale yet very important business entrepreneurship. And I just found that story just a story of resilience, an incredibly inspiring story. And so I know a lot of historians kind of not ignore street food vending, but maybe they use street food vending as an interesting anecdote to open up a chapter of a book about the past. Or often we draw upon marketplaces. You see this in movies all the time to set the scene of a different country. But I'm really interested in paying attention to and honoring and respecting the work of street vendors, and so especially women. And so, yeah, that's how I answer that question.
How do you translate your skills and experience as a food historian into culinary practices?
That's a great question too. So I have grown up loving to cook. I cooked alongside my mother and grandmother. As part of my training in graduate school, I volunteered at some historic house museums in Louisiana, where I actually learned basic techniques in open hearth cooking. So cooking over the fire and cooking over flames. And that was eye-opening as to the just how physically demanding historic cooking was in terms of maintaining fires, but also the physical kind of repercussions of that kind of work, where my lungs would be sore for days after working in these historic open hearth kitchens because I was inhaling so much smoke from cooking over an open flame. So there's different ways that I try to engage food cultures and culinary cultures through my work. For example, I'm writing this book on Chef Lena Richard, who was a Black chef in New Orleans, who was the first Black woman to author a Creole cookbook in New Orleans and the first Black chef to have her own television show on TV in 1949. And I was really hoping when I started off on this project that there would be recordings of Chef Lena Richard's program, that that there might be evidence of her show in the archives, but it turned out there are no recordings. And there are very few materials left from her life, a handful of photos, a few letters, something that would fit in one archival box, right? And so I was trying to find a way to connect to her and to understand her better. And so 10 years ago, when I started this project, my mother and I started cooking through her cookbook, which is Lena Richard's New Orleans cookbook. And it was through making those gumbos, the red beans and rice, the stewed turnips, some of her cakes that I really got to know part of her legacy through making that food. Because like I said, we don't have recordings of her speaking. I don't know what her personality is like. And many of the people who knew her in New Orleans are no longer alive. And so it was through her food that at least there was some kind of connection, some semblance of a shared experience. And so I do find cooking the food of the historic cookbooks that I look at and use as resources is really important to understand where my historic subjects are coming from, what ingredients they had at their disposal, the skill and knowledge embedded in those recipes that they're trying to share with readers. It really unfolds an entirely different world of looking at cooking and culinary technique as a highly skilled thing, a highly skilled endeavor. And so it just increases my respect for the women and the men and women that I study. So yes, and I love to cook. I still love to cook. I often prepare historic recipes for friends pre-pandemic during dinner parties. And then as a historian, I would obviously, add in a few snippets, not lectures per se, but fun facts about the amazing men and women who had written those recipes and kind of their significance in our country's history.
So I'm guessing as a historian, you do spend quite a bit of time researching and really diving into the material and seeing what you can find. But I think your role looks a little bit different because you do have a strong public-facing presence as well with cooking demos and programming for your exhibits. Would you consider yourself more of a people person, or how does your personality come into play with your career?
So I would say my personality definitely comes into play with my career. I chose public history because I feel more comfortable and I feel happier and more fulfilled speaking to people and expressing and sharing my research and my findings through diverse media, not just writing, but through exhibits, which are very artful and require a lot of visual sensibilities and everything from color theory to the arrangement of objects. I like that form of expression. I wouldn't call myself an artist per se, but I've always enjoyed art and expressing my passion. like I said, through different ways, because we all learn differently. Some people prefer reading, others prefer experiential, kind of tactile or sensory experiences. And I think public history allows me to satisfy, my ways of learning and knowing, but also other people's ways of learning beyond just like your traditional text. And I will say, I grew up loving musical theater, loving choir. And I always would be, in high school, I was never the lead of the high school musical. I was more often than not the over enthusiastic choir member. But I was just like, I loved performing. I loved singing with other people. And I actually continued that in undergrad. And even at grad school, I was part of Duke's Lady Blue a cappella group, the one and only graduate student who performed it with that group. Like I said, I had gone straight from undergrad to graduate school and was really looking for a place to build community and make connections beyond the history department. And, a cappella really was a place for me to make those connections. And I think kind of tune into Duke's campus more so than other graduate students who didn't necessarily interact with undergrads on a social level. So I'm really grateful for the amazing young women that I met who are now women out in the real world. But it really I built such a fondness for Duke's campus culture. And so, yes, back to the idea, performance is key. It's huge. And I even learned that from my father, who was, like I said, a high school history teacher. He always saw teaching as part performance, because you have to keep the attention of your audience. You have to make it interesting and accessible to them. And he was a great orator. He is a great orator. And I love listening to him tell stories. So I think I'm inspired in part by my dad and his love for teaching. And I take that into my own career with my live cooking demonstrations, or, the podcasts that I'll contribute to, or the exhibits that I work on. It's it's a performative way of sharing, important insights into our country's past and present.
I'd love to hear more about the criteria you use to curate your exhibits, particularly food transforming the American table. What did that look like?
So I actually started working on food transforming the American table while I was finishing up my last semester at Duke in the PhD program. And so through a Versatile Humanists grant, I was able to create an internship opportunity. And I went to the museum and I said, I have this opportunity to gain professional experience. We've been in touch for many years now. I had been, just following the American Food History Project at the National Museum of American History. And we had always talked about ways of the possibility of maybe interning, but, obviously no guarantees. But it just so happened to work out with their goals and objectives and their needs in the summer of 2017 that I was able to create this internship opportunity. And it involved working on a refresh, a kind of renovation of sorts of the existing food exhibition, which shared the same title, but hadn't been, refreshed in about 10, 12 years. And when they opened food originally, the idea was that it would be open for one year, 2 years. But, the American public fell so much in love with this exhibit, which contains Julia Child's kitchen, for example, which explores these massive transformations in American cooking and American life from 1950 to 2000. We wanted to give that just a facelift and to bring the story not just from 2000, but up to 2017, and add in new stories based on the feedback that we got from our museum visitors. And so when I joined that team, one of the forms of feedback that we got was that people wanted to learn more about how dieting and nutrition had changed since 1950. So I worked with my colleague, Paula Johnson, who's a curator at the museum, to create a case called On a Diet. And it really does look at the science, maybe I don't want to say not science, pseudoscience, but like the science and beliefs about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. And we see those articles come out all the time. Coffee's good for your heart. Chocolate's bad for this. Eat eggs, don't eat eggs. Is cholesterol, where do we find cholesterol in our foods? And so we looked at those changes over time, and we looked at cookbooks, magazine articles, scientific studies, just online gurus, all of these different sources that were shaping individuals' perspectives on how and what they should eat. And so that was an interesting kind of exhibit case to work on, because there are so many contradicting ideas about our bodies and about what's best for our bodies. It's also a highly politicized issue. It's your body. You should be able to decide what to do with it. And it calls into question, what is the role of the government, local, state, national government in suggesting what we consume or regulating what we consume? So it was an interesting kind of, I don't know, landscape to navigate as a historian, because we don't want to present a one-sided image or a one-sided story. We want to include as many viewpoints as possible so that people visiting our museum can come to their own conclusions about, the question, what should I eat? There was another part of the refresh that I really enjoyed working on, and this was with my colleague, Steve Velasquez. And he really wanted to bring in an exhibit case that would look at the role more. We had an exhibit case in the old version of the exhibit, but we wanted to kind of make this case more robust. And it looked at the role of migration in shaping and diversifying how and what we eat across the United States. And so we looked at those 1964, 1965 immigration law changes that allowed more and more community members from Africa, from East Asia, from other parts of the world that had historically been barred really from migrating to the United States in large numbers, how that change and shift in the law really introduced an opportunity for so many people to come to the United States, bringing their food cultures with them. And we looked at food entrepreneurship, we looked at community involvement, we looked at the impact and influence of migrant communities from Vietnam to Ethiopia, Guatemala, on the foods we see in our grocery stores. And that was a really important exhibit case for me. It was the first time I was able to go out into the field, as we say at the museum, to interview these amazing restaurateurs, these amazing chefs and community leaders and educators, business people who migrated to this country and found that economic toehold for themselves through food. And their stories are so inspiring. Again, these stories of resilience, of tenacity. And so to have them trust us with those stories, to record those stories and archive them at our museum, to collect objects that really highlight and showcase those stories, it was a beautiful practice of vulnerability and respect, empathy. And I found that to be one of the most meaningful aspects of the exhibit refresh. And it's so important because as a community, as a country, we see xenophobia very present in our lives, especially with violence against our APA community members of late. We see this horrific face of xenophobia, and to have in our museum a just, empathetic representation of Americans from all over the world, from all diverse parts of our country, it's so important. And so I feel like that exhibit case, along with our programs and our objects and our blog posts, really help to provide Americans with the resources they need to really get a truer representation and picture of our diverse community. So that was an important part, I think, in terms of curating.
Was there ever a moment from undergrad until now that you weren't sure if food history was the career path for you?
That's such a good question. I actually started off undergrad wanting to be an evolutionary biologist. There was a professor at Yale named Richard Prum, who worked on bird evolution in the Yucatan Peninsula. And he looked at these amazing birds of paradise and the mating rituals and dances that they would perform with these beautiful feathers. And I just was like, that is what I want to do. I heard this professor give a talk. I had always thought I would be a marine biologist or an evolutionary biologist. I had interned at the Pittsburgh Zoo and our PPG aquarium in Pittsburgh. And I just thought, oh, I want to work with this professor. I want to look at ultraviolet colors in bird feathers and how they're used in these ritualistic, dances, mating dances. Obviously, that did not, I did not actually pursue that path. I got a little bit marred in the requirements for a biology major, taking calculus and chemistry and organic chemistry and statistics. I was missing that evolutionary side of biology that I really wanted to study. And all the while I was taking history classes, and I thought, why do I love these classes so much more than these like standard science classes I'm having to take? So I just decided to switch over to history at first, and then that internship at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum really introduced me to this concept of food history. And in a way, it was kind of like, I'm never turning back. I'm just committed to this. But I will say, I would meet professors, I would meet fellow graduate students, when I'd say, they'd ask me what my research was on, and I'd say, oh, I'm studying the history of New Orleans, a food history of New Orleans. And they would just go, huh, huh. They would laugh. They would laugh at me because they didn't really know how to process whether or not food history was a serious endeavor. And so there was a part of me, like an identity crisis, where I thought, well, do I describe myself as a US historian first? And then I kind of establish my credibility there, and then introduce the fact that I'm using food as a lens into the past? Or do I just really embrace this idea that I'm a food historian? And that can mean whatever I want it to mean. Some food historians really do look very, very closely at recipes. They look very closely at the evolution of a dish over time, or they might concentrate on a commodity like cod or coffee and really just focused on that commodity. But I was always studying the city of New Orleans through its food culture. I'm really interested in people, like those food vendors that I mentioned. And so I kind of waffled back and forth, but eventually I came to just really dive headfirst and say, you know what? My dad's a historian. My mom's a food entrepreneur. This is my passion and my love. I am just going to embrace wholeheartedly that this is the way I see history, through the lens of food. And I'm going to own that. And I'm not going to hide because I'm insecure that someone might not take me seriously, or that I'm afraid there might not be a job out there for me when I graduate. Instead, I leaned in, as we say now, and I think that was for the best. It's not to say that I was 100% sure of success or 100% sure that everything would be okay, but I tried to push beyond my fear and really just focus on things that I loved doing. And so I'm happy to say, worked out for me in that I graduated from my PhD program. I have my dream job that really suits my interests in research and public speaking and academic writing, and curation. It really encompasses all those elements of what I'm most interested in terms of history and education. But, I realized that's not always going to be the case for everyone. You could be passionate about a topic and things may not work out perfectly as you imagined. But I will say there were road bumps along the way for me as well. And there were times where I was very insecure about my job security. I was really afraid that I wasn't going to be employable as a food historian when I graduated. But my family was very supportive, and they reminded me that I am a historian. I am cultivating skills like public speaking and writing and research skills, organizational skills that would be that are versatile, that would be relevant for many jobs. So even if I didn't end up in a museum, or even if I didn't end up, say, teaching at a university, that I could take that skill set elsewhere and, forge my own path to find my own toehold, just like the amazing street vendors that I study. So yeah, certainly had some insecurities along the way, but I think perseverance is key. And even when upsets happen, you just keep pursuing what inspires you. And I certainly there have been moments where I didn't love food history, I have to tell you. I think sometimes it can seem, I remember feeling as an undergrad, for example, people telling me, pursue what you love, pursue what you love. And there were times where I didn't feel that love for my subject because of insecurities or stress. But I think looking back over the last 15 years, there really was, I really did make choices to choose something I was really interested in, incredibly curious about. And yes, it's hard history. There's not a lot of evidence about street vendors. There's not a lot of evidence about, historically marginalized communities in our archives, but I didn't want that to stand in my way. Where there is a will, there is a way. And so I just had to think creatively about interpreting that history. And so, yeah, I would say if you're experiencing some doubt with your career choices or your goals for the future, that's absolutely normal. I think it comes in waves. And but I do think perseverance is key. And if you do keep pushing forward, you will be able to carve out a place for yourself. It may not be exactly what you imagined, but I do think if you are pursuing something you're really inspired by or passionate about, you will find the work fulfilling, even with some of the other kind of insecurities or job security issues.
I love that. That's wonderful to hear and so refreshing too. What have you experienced while striving to be a successful woman in your field?
That's a fascinating question. So, like I mentioned, my mom and my aunts were women entrepreneurs in business. They wore the power suits of the 1980s. And, just growing up in that world, I did take note as a young child that they were often the only women in the room at these conventions for grocery stores, food distributors. I saw how strong my mom and my aunts had to be to survive and thrive in a male-dominated industry. And so I've always been very mindful of, power dynamics in the food industry and in different industries. And originally, as I said, I was interested in evolutionary biology. I do think the sciences are a place where women have historically been underrepresented, although that's starting to shift now. Now I bring this into the context of my own world as a food historian. It's very different as a food historian because and as a public historian, many of my colleagues are women. Many of the people who are interested in food history are women. And so I find myself in this incredibly supportive, women-centric work environment that really I find just wonderful. And it kind of relates back to my singing groups. As I mentioned, I always was in all women singing groups. I find that environment to be, like I said, very supportive, incredibly creative. And so I feel very comfortable in my work environment at the National Museum of American History. And that's not to say that I'm not collaborating with or working with my colleagues who identify as men, or that I'm not collaborating with chefs and historians who identify as men. I certainly am, and I love working with them. But to have a supervisor who is a woman, to have the head of my department at my museum is a woman, and the head of our museum, the first woman director of the National Museum of American History, Anthea Hartig, joined our team about 3 years ago. And so having all of those amazing women in leadership roles makes me feel utterly confident that they'll be supportive of my ambitions, that I can pursue my passions and not be questioned for my desires to, I don't know, make change, to climb the ladder, to, question their authority, because we kind of share this this gender dynamic. Now, I will say that there have been times as a woman that have been tricky, and not necessarily even ones that I've experienced myself, but as a historian, I have colleagues at conferences that we would go to, history conferences, where I would be on text chains, on our phones, with messages warning us of the male colleagues who were handsy, gropey, who would try to make moves on young women scholars, and that used this text chain. It said, if you find yourself in a tricky situation and someone will come and get you out of it, one of us will come and get you out of that situation. And I was horrified to realize that this was an environment that was known to exist at these history conferences. But, I was also heartened to know that my fellow colleagues were looking out for each other. And I think we've taken a more outward approach with workshops and actually using our support networks within these historical associations to directly address these issues and the biases and the discrimination and assault associated with gender. And so there are more relatively extreme examples there, but also just being a young woman, I got my PhD when I was 29. I'm enthusiastic. That comes with certain associations of credibility. If you're an enthusiastic person, sometimes first impressions are, oh, she's not serious. Add a food historian on top of that. Can we take her seriously at all? And so there have been times that I felt that pressure, that I wasn't being taken seriously, even though my scholarship is incredibly rigorous. But I felt that being someone who's enthusiastic, someone who's gregarious and young, and a young woman, has not necessarily worked against me, but it grates against others' personality types. Someone who's more reserved, or perhaps a more mature colleague might find my personality grating or just not what they're looking for. So those are just kind of personality quirks that we all have to navigate in our workplaces. And so I try to be mindful of my colleagues and how they like to work or not work with me, and vice versa. I think there's always a middle ground that you can meet people at, but I do think as a young woman, you have to develop that thick skin and not take it too personally when people may just not want to be your friend, and that's okay, as long as you're producing good scholarship together. So.
For this next little bit, I have a few rapid fire questions for you. These are really quick. It's just like 1-2 word responses.
Okay.
And so they'll fly by, but I think they'll be pretty fun. The first one is your best easy weeknight meal.
Oh my gosh, what do I make? Probably a curry, like a green curry, green Thai curry. I'm very into the Instant Pot now. So yes, Instant Pot curry.
Favorite food to have as leftovers?
Oh, turkey sandwich, leftover from Thanksgiving. I'll say that.
What ingredient is a must-have in your kitchen?
So good. Is it sad to say salt? Ugh, I love salt. But I would also say my spicy honey is one of my new favorite things to drizzle on all kinds of savory and sweet dishes. So.
Ooh, that sounds so cool. On a scale of 1 to 5, does your role offer a work-life balance?
Is one very work-life balance or not work-life balance?
1 is not work-life balance.
Okay, then I would say 5. I have a beautiful work-life balance, and that's part of the reason I chose this career. Yep.
Blank is a skill you use almost every day.
Writing. Yep.
Blank is a skill you learned since graduation.
Ugh. Negotiating skills and office politics skills. Never had to deal with that before.
What is a single action someone attending this talk can do in order to prepare for a career in your field?
Conduct informational interviews. Connect with me. I can connect you with other people, chat with people, build your network. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll be keeping an eye on the chat for any questions that any of y'all would like to share. But I'd love to ask a couple more personal questions while we're waiting for some of those. What does your time management skills look like in order to sustain that work-life balance?
You know, it's so funny because I was so ecstatic to start my job at the Smithsonian because it was in an office and it was a 9 to 5. It was built in structure. And after 7 years of graduate school where there was essentially no structure, I was really looking forward to that. And I had it for a few years and I just loved it. But with the pandemic, I felt like I've been thrown back into graduate school almost where, you know, I'm at home working at my desk and we're encouraged to telework when we can based on our responsibilities for our family members and caregiving. And so I have felt like I've been thrown back into graduate school in a way, but I do find for myself prioritizing writing, whether it's writing an article or a blog post or working on my books, getting that done right in the morning before even opening email is so key. I do think giving yourself the time, like truly structured time away from work during a lunch break or during a walk outside, a short walk outside is so key, to put your phone away, to keep your emails at bay and really just disconnect. I always find that I come back to my office with a renewed sense of energy and an ability to tackle the work. And I will say, I do not have my work email on my phone. I do not have social media on my phone because I only have social media tied to my work life, Twitter, Instagram, things like that. I don't have it for my social life, but really creating those barriers and not checking email after work hours, you can still get your job done. You can still do it really well. Possibly even better if you create those really strict barriers. And so they're not easy to maintain, but I've found that my mental health has just been really fantastic, by structuring life that way between work and play.
We have a few questions in the chat. The first one is, how has COVID affected the work that the museum does? Did you have to pivot quickly to new projects? Is there anything that might affect museum work in the future?
Yes, it has really impacted our life. So, prior in so many ways, prior to COVID-19, we were really dependent on in-person communications. Yes, our office had Microsoft Teams and the Microsoft suite, but really we were into picking up the phones, dropping by each other's offices, having brainstorming sessions. And with COVID-19, we had to dive into the Microsoft Office suite in ways that we never thought we would, using, just like their chat functions, setting up Teams meetings, doing collaborative documents where you can live edit at the same time. Some of our museum colleagues used those in the past, but not really. And so we, over the course of the year, have caught up to the 21st century, and I think a really fulfilling way. I will say, as someone who does a lot of public programs, I miss interacting with our public directly. I miss being in the Coulter Plaza where we have a beautiful demonstration kitchen stage with our lighting and our microphones and our guest chefs on stage. I miss that space in front of a live audience and getting their questions and just having the smell and the sound of the food that we're making on stage right there. We've had to shift to our virtual space, and that's been tough. We had to cancel 10 live cooking demonstration programs in 2019. And so there was a lot of work and research and opportunity that was lost there, stories that we're not really going to be able to tell just because of time and resources. So I'm sad about that. And I will say our museum is working really hard to pivot to the digital realm, but I don't think we're in a place where we want to be. I think we want to produce more public programs that are virtual. I think we want to engage our audiences on diverse platforms from Facebook to Twitter to YouTube, you name it. But our museum, it's part of the federal government. It's a large bureaucracy. It takes a lot of time and money and staff effort to create digital programs, and our staff are overwhelmed, especially our colleagues in our kind of digital programming office. We had like one person who's a video media expert in the entire museum, and everyone's trying to collaborate with her to produce programs, right? And so it's been very overwhelming. And as part of the federal government, it's not easy to hire someone quickly. It can take years for a job to be listed on the federal government jobs website. And so I do think we're kind of struggling a little bit within our within the kind of structure of our museum, but we have produced some fantastic programs like our Pandemic Perspective series. We have produced 3 digital cooking of history programs. A lot of our colleagues have been able to find funding and resources and partnerships outside of the museum to produce just incredibly relevant and important materials on the APA community, for example, and also for Black Lives Matter. There's been a lot of great content, podcasts, Facebook Live events and whatnot, addressing these major racial issues in our country. So in some ways, I think we're frustrated we can't do more, but in other ways, I'm incredibly proud of what my colleagues have been able to produce.
Another fun question from Laura. How do you make spicy honey?
So I have not made spicy honey from scratch. I actually got it as a gift. I've purchased it from a local honey maker in Pittsburgh before, and my dad recently got me some for Christmas. But I'm assuming they use chili flakes or chili oil to add a little bit of spice to the honey. The one that I'm using right now is called Mike's Spicy Honey, I think. And you can get it at some of your local, like large scale grocery chains like Safeway or Kroger or, things like that. So I'd check out and see if they have it in the condiment aisle. And if not, I'm sure you might be able to grab some on Amazon or something like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Young. It's such a pleasure to hear about your career, all the experiences you've had so far. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. And if you do have any questions, I'll put my email here. You can always follow up if you want to network and things like that. So please feel free to reach out.